On April 15, 1912, at 2:20 a.m., the White Star Line's RMS Titanic slipped beneath the waves just 2.5 hours after hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic. As the ship went down, some 710 passengers and crew watched in disbelief from the 18 lifeboats which had managed to escape. And today's episode is about what happened next. What happened once they were rescued by the Carpathia, and what did they eat aboard the ship? So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video as we dine aboard the Carpathia, this time on Tasting History. So I've done a number of episodes about the Titanic because it is a topic that I never grow weary of, but I usually stop the story at the sinking, that moment when 1,500 people lost their lives. But today I thought I would talk about what happened afterwards, what happened to those who actually survived the sinking. Now in those 7 videos that I've already done on Titanic, I make foods that were served aboard that ship. And there is a lot of information about the food served aboard the ship. There's a lot less information when it comes to the food served aboard Carpathia. But I did find that following the rescue, the ship's captain, Arthur Rostron, reported what his orders had been the morning that they rescued the Titanic survivors. And his orders to the chief stewards was to have coffee, tea, soup, etc. in each saloon, blankets in the saloons, at the gangways, and some in the boats, to see all rescued, cared for, and immediate wants attended to. So soup was the first food served to the Titanic survivors once they boarded the Carpathia. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly what soup that was, but I did find a menu from April 18th, which would have been for the last meal served before docking in New York. And among the dishes served were turbot hollandaise, haunch of mutton, boiled capon, and Garfield potatoes, which are just a fancy fried potato, and they had 2 soups, consommé du Beloy and potage cressy. Now I couldn't find anything on consommé du Beloy, but I was able to find a recipe for potage cressy from none other than Auguste Escoffier, the chef at the Ritz Hotel, which says stew the carrots in butter with onions as for purée cressy, but replace the thickening of rice with 250 grams potatoes and moisten with 1 liter water. Season with salt. When cooked, pass through a fine sieve and adjust the consistency with 2 deciliters very fresh cream. Pass through a fine strainer at the last moment and add 150 grams butter. Garnish with chervil and small croutons of bread fried in butter. For more details, I went to look at his recipe for purée cressy, which has specific amounts for all of the other ingredients that are in this soup. The cool thing about this soup is many of his soups take hours or even days to prepare, but this soup takes about 25 minutes, which is pretty awesome. Though if you don't even have 25 minutes, then you could make an even quicker meal from today's sponsor, Factor. Factor, which is owned by HelloFresh, delivers chef-crafted, ready-to-eat meals right to your doorstep. They're freshly made and never frozen and only take a few minutes to prepare. They are real lifesavers on those days where I'm doing research and I realize after a few hours have gone by that I've just totally blown by lunch or dinner and don't really have time to make something, so I could just grab a Factor meal and heat it up in a few minutes and it's ready to eat. They have 35 wholesome meals to choose from each week, including vegan options, keto, and calorie smart. I also really like these cold brew latte protein shakes that they sent me. They're a wonderful way to start the morning. They have other breakfasts and snacks as well, but these are my favorite right now. So if you want to give Factor a try, then head to factor75.com or just click the link in the description and use the code TASTINGHISTORY50 to get 50% off of your first box plus 20% off of your next month of orders. That's code TASTINGHISTORY50 at factor75.com for 50% off of your first box plus 20% off of your next month of orders. And now, let us get back to our soup. Now I like Escoffier's recipes because he does usually give very specific amounts for all of the ingredients. So I'm going to tell you exactly what he calls for, which are all in metric. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 75 grams of butter. I got this really fancy, expensive French salted butter, and since this recipe is going to have a lot of butter in it, I do suggest getting the best butter you can find. 100 grams of sliced onion, 600 grams of sliced carrots, a sprig of thyme, 2 pinches of salt, 1 pinch of sugar, 1 liter of mineral water, 250 grams russet potatoes, 200 milliliters of heavy cream, and another 150 grams of butter. You also need some more butter, or better yet clarified butter or ghee, to fry up the croutons, for which you'll need a handful of cubes of French bread. But before we get to the croutons, we can start the soup by melting the 75 grams of butter in a large pot over medium-low heat. And throughout this entire recipe, you never want the heat to go above medium. Really, it should be closer to low the whole time. Once the butter is melted, add the onions and thyme and carrots, then the salt and sugar, and stir everything around to coat it all in the butter. Then let the butter slowly come to a sizzle. And one of the reasons you want to keep it at a very low heat here is because you don't want the onions to get any color at all, let alone become brown. Once the butter at the bottom of the pot is sizzling, set the lid on and let it cook for 5 minutes. Essentially, you're just letting the carrots and the onions just kind of steam in the butter to cook them. That actually sounds like a wonderful spa treatment, a butter steam. I'd get that. After 5 minutes, add the water and the potatoes and give it a stir. Let it slowly come up to a low simmer, just so you can see a little bubbling, then set the lid back on and let it cook for another 15 minutes or so, or until you can easily mash a potato with a fork. Then you can remove the thyme and either puree the soup by pushing it through a strainer, or to make life a lot easier, use an immersion blender to make a smooth puree, and then you can pass it through a fine sieve. It should be quite smooth when it comes out the other side. Then return that to the stove over low heat and add the cream and butter, stirring in the butter until it's fully melted, and then leave the soup to very slowly heat up. Now again, I am not sure that this is the exact soup that the Titanic survivors would have had when they boarded the ship, but it is definitely a soup that they would have had on that voyage on Carpathia. A ship that would probably not really be remembered today had it not been the one to answer the call when they received a message from Titanic's wireless operator, Jack Phillips. A message of, "Come at once, we have struck a berg." It was 12:25 on the morning of April 15, 1912, and most of the passengers on the Cunard Line's RMS Carpathia had already gone to bed. And the lone wireless operator, Harold Cottam, was about to do the same when he decided to pick up his headphones to just have one last listen. He expected to hear the RMS Titanic on her maiden voyage tapping out passenger messages to friends and family back home. But instead, they had gone quiet. And when he did finally get a message from the Titanic, it said, "Come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man." CQD meaning come quick, danger. It was also one of the first times that he would hear the new distress call of SOS. Cottam immediately relayed the message to the ship's captain, Arthur Rostron, who wasted no time changing course toward the north at full speed, toward the Titanic's position, which was 60 or so miles away. Now at this point, Rostron believed that when they finally got to the scene, that the Titanic would be there, just badly damaged, and perhaps they would need to take on some of the passengers and the mail. But then they received the message of, "We are putting passengers off in small boats, women and children in boats, cannot last much longer, losing power, engine room flooded." And that's when Rostron came to the realization that by the time they reached Titanic's position, there may not be a ship there at all. Now, even as the Carpathia turned and started steaming full steam ahead toward the Titanic's position, most of the passengers were still asleep, and even those who were awake said that they didn't realize that anything was wrong. Later on, one passenger said, "The first intimation anybody got of the fact that anything unusual was about to take place was the order given the steward to prepare breakfast for 3,000. That would be enough for Carpathia's own 743 passengers, along with the 2,240 passengers and crew that Captain Rostron expected to rescue when they arrived on the scene." Harold Cottam, the wireless operator, was still in contact with Titanic, though at around 1:45, their signal started to weaken, and then at 2:05 a.m., the signal disappeared altogether. That was the moment that Titanic's power was lost. And only 15 minutes later, at 2:20 a.m., the Titanic would take her final plunge beneath the waves. But Carpathia had no way of knowing that that is what had just happened, though they realized that the lack of signal was not a good sign. So on they went at full steam ahead, until at 2:45 a.m., the lookout aboard Carpathia announced that there was an iceberg right ahead. Fortunately, the ship was able to slow down and steer around the iceberg, narrowly escaping the exact same fate that had befell the Titanic only hours before. Then Captain Rostron ordered the ship full steam ahead once again, though they started to see more and more icebergs appearing around them. They were now in the ice field that the Titanic had been in. Later, Rostron would recall that when day broke, I saw the ice I'd steamed through during the night. I shuddered and could only think that some other hand than mine was on that helm during the night. But along with the icebergs, the morning light let them discern the very first lifeboat from the Titanic. And at 4:10 a.m., lifeboat number 2, overseen by 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall, came alongside the ship. She was not much more than half filled with women and children, and was in the charge of an officer. One woman was heartbroken and uncontrollable. She cried hysterically for her husband, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that she could be restrained from jumping into the sea to look for him. As each lifeboat was raised from the water and the survivors brought on deck, they were bundled in blankets and given over to the care of the medical team and Chief Steward Henry Hughes. Those who required medical attention were sent to Carpathia's dining saloons where makeshift hospitals had been set up. Those who didn't require immediate medical attention were given soup, coffee, and tea, along with brandy and whiskey. Many were escorted to the smoking room, the lounge, and the library, which had all been hastily converted into dormitories. It was also soon evident that most of the 3,000 breakfasts that had been prepared would not be required. Of the more than 2,200 passengers and crew that Captain Rostron had expected to rescue, only 710 were in the lifeboats, and several of them ended up dying of exposure once on Carpathia. The Episcopal Reverend Father Anderson, who was aboard Carpathia, recalled that it was indeed a sad sight to see. Some of the people were stunned, some weeping, not loud goings-on, you know. It seemed they were just overwhelmed by grief. They were too cold to move about. And once the last lifeboat had been unloaded and everyone had been given breakfast, something that one of the Carpathia passengers described as a scene of confusion, Captain Rostron approached Father Anderson and asked him to perform a service before they left the scene. "We are practically standing over the spot where the Titanic sank, so before we leave, I'd like to have you go down into the salon and conduct a service. I have 2 things in mind. One is thanksgiving for those we have been able to save. The other is a prayer for those who have died by drowning." And 10 minutes later, Father Anderson gave a service in the first-class dining saloon. The people sat all huddled about, stunned, weeping, huddled together. I felt the service should be short, so I read a brief portion of the burial service and said a prayer for the repose of the souls of those who died in the disaster. One of the passengers who was rescued was none other than the director of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay. Following the disaster, he would be cast, mostly undeservedly, as a coward and a villain, but that is not how he was seen when he was first rescued. When Bruce Ismay was taken on board, the first thing he did was to demand something to eat and went into the dining room for some breakfast. One of the stewards gave it to him, and he offered the man $2 as a tip. At first it was refused, but he insisted, saying that he was going to see to it that all of the boys on the Carpathia would be rewarded generously. It was then that the steward learned that the hungry passenger was Mr. Ismay. After the first meal, Mr. Ismay kept to the stateroom which he was sharing with another passenger, and ate all of his meals there. I did not see him again in the restaurant. It was following a conversation with Bruce Ismay that Captain Rostron decided that instead of going on to Europe, where the Carpathia had been headed, they would turn around and return to New York, where they had just come from. One reason, of course, was that is where the Titanic passengers had been headed in the first place. But another reason was that even though they only saved 700 passengers instead of the expected 2,200 passengers and crew from Titanic, Carpathia still was not equipped to handle such a crowd. The passage lasted for 4 days, and the limits of the crew and food supplies were tested. Carpathian passengers and Titanic survivors doubled up in cabins. Meals were served in multiple sittings. Kitchen staff worked round the clock. Food supplies nearly ran out. Many of the Carpathian passengers wrote home to their loved ones while they were still on the ship, and while they were obviously sympathetic to the Titanic survivors' plight, they also often let slip that they were somewhat inconvenienced by the fact that they had all of these new people on board. Just 2 days after picking up the Titanic survivors, first-class passenger Mary Fabian wrote to her family saying that the boat is terribly crowded. The first night I gave up my room to 3 exhausted ladies and managed to get an upper berth and a room for 4. though I had expected to sleep on deck. The dining room, library, and smoking rooms are full of people each night, sleeping on mattresses on the floors and tables. The meals have been more or less confused until today, but even this morning I saw 2 or 3 people having breakfast standing up in the hall. Another first-class passenger, Philip Morrow, who was sailing with his daughter Margaret, wrote a letter detailing the change on the ship as they steamed back to New York. You can imagine the depression and discomfort pervading this boat, with such a cargo of concentrated abjectness and misery added to the rather full passenger list that we had at the start. There are more Titanic passengers than Carpathians, and of course, there are no accommodations for them in the ordinary sense. I gave up my room, which has 4 bunks, and spent the night in a steamer chair. Do not expect to take any clothes off till we reach New York. The first and second class dining rooms and the writing room were filled with women lying on the floors, tables, and sofas. The smoking rooms were allotted to the men. Margaret has given away most of her things, underwear, etc. There has been no great demand for masculine apparel, but I quickly parted with some stockings, pajamas, and handkerchiefs, besides the nice felt slippers my dear Charlie gave me. The dozen toothbrushes I had were most acceptable. Of course, the people had absolutely nothing but what was on their persons, not even hand togs. They were told up to the last few moments that there was no danger of the ship's going down. But even slightly put out, most of the Carpathian passengers were more than happy to give up their beds and their clothes to help these people who in some cases had lost everything. Of course, many had lost husbands and parents and friends and co-workers, but they also lost all of their possessions. Many of them were just wearing their pajamas and had no money. They had left everything in their staterooms, which were now at the bottom of the Atlantic. And in the case of many of the third-class passengers, they had lost literally everything that they had in the world. That's why in those 4 days aboard Carpathia, some of the survivors got together and formed the Committee to Assist Destitute Passengers. Headed by Margaret Brown, they endeavored to make sure funds would be raised to ensure all survivors would be taken care of upon their arrival in New York. They even extracted a promise from Bruce Ismay that passengers of the Titanic requiring assistance will be sent to their destinations and will be supplied with necessary clothing. They also formed a committee to raise money to give the crew of the Carpathia medals of appreciation, as well as a loving cup for Captain Rostron upon their arrival in New York. Now, while those few committee members busied themselves with that work, most of the survivors had really nothing to occupy their minds over those next 4 days. Some of them wrote messages to their families which would be transmitted via wireless by Harold Cottam and Harold Bride, the 22-year-old junior wireless operator rescued from Titanic. But most recalled just talking to other passengers about their experience, or else sitting there in silence, because many of them were in a state of shock, as can be seen from a letter that third-class passenger Bertha Mulvihill sent to her sister. Dear Maud, experience is great. I am fine and dandy, never better. What time did you hear of the disaster? I am so glad I was in it. I shall never forget it. We are just about in New York, having a jolly time. Don't worry, the passengers on the Carpathia gave us clothes. I never saw such a sight as when the dear old Titanic sank. She broke in 2 pieces. The scene was awful. Don't think me mad for being so happy to witness the sight. I am with a jolly crowd on this old ship. I am awfully happy, like the night I was born. Never felt happier in my life. Despite Bertha's upbeat letter, most of the passengers recall the return to New York to be a somber one, and it didn't help everyone's frayed nerves that it was storming much of the trip back, and it was still raining when the Carpathia finally entered New York Harbor on the evening of April 18th. Now that is the end of the ocean-going voyage of the Titanic survivors, and I was going to cut it off there and be done with it, but there is so much interesting information surrounding the disembarking from Carpathia that I have decided to do another video that I will release later this week covering some of that topic, and I'll be making another dish that was served aboard the ship on its way home. So keep an eye out for that later this week, but for now, we need to finish up our potage cressy. So before we try the soup, you need to make your croutons by melting a couple tablespoons of butter, or better yet, clarified butter or ghee, which has a higher smoke point, in a pan, and then toss in the bread cubes and coat them with the butter. Keep them moving around as they toast up Shouldn't take more than a couple minutes. Then set them on a paper towel to soak up the butter. Then you can dish up your soup and set a few croutons on top along with some chervil, though if you can't find any chervil, you can use parsley or cilantro. And here we are, potage cressy as served to the Titanic survivors aboard RMS Carpathia. So I think before anything, my favorite thing about this soup is the color. It's so vibrant, the orange, it just looks fun. Here we go. That has a lot of butter, a lot of butter and cream in it. That's really, really good. I mean, it tastes like carrots, obviously, but it's so creamy and buttery. That is really, really, really good. I'm actually shocked at how developed the flavors are because it didn't take very long to make. You know, it's not something that has to sit there and cook for a long time. I bet it'll be even better actually tomorrow when it's heated up, reheated. Yeah, so this is amazing. And the flavor is carrot forward, but you do get a little bit of the potato as well. And that's really what's lending it its thickness. It is thick, but it's also really creamy and really smooth. I think the more you can get it through that fine mesh strainer, the better. There are not many dishes that I make here on the channel that I will make in my daily life just because I either don't have time or usually like once I've moved on from an episode, I've moved on. I'm gonna be making this again, like throughout the winter. It's kind of the perfect winter dish and it's so easy and yeah, this will be part of my rotation. So again, don't forget there is going to be a part 2 to this episode later on this week. So make sure you are subscribed and hit the notification bell so that pops up when I release it. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.